Welcome to our fun little study group for PP 5375 Economic Analysis for Public Policy and Management. Today we're tackling the readings from Section O5 Choice, Preferences, Utility. We're really getting into the core microeconomic blueprints today. Our mission: understand those three fundamental steps that explain pretty much every consumer decision. From grabbing coffee to shaping huge policy debates. It's a deep dive into the basic theory of consumer behavior, how economists try to model the way people decide what to do with limited resources.
Exactly. And this framework, consumer choice theory, it really is the workhorse for both microeconomics and, importantly for this course, public policy analysis. I mean, think about it. The excerpts from Pindyck and Rubenfeld's microeconomics show it clearly. It's used by, say, General Mills trying to figure out the best price for Apple Cinnamon Cheerios.
Right.
And it's the same core logic Congress uses when designing programs like food stamps, now SNA. It's fundamental.
So our whole session today is really about pulling together those key readings. The Pindyck-Rubenfeld chapter excerpts, naturally, and then the course notes in PPTX on consumer choice theory, plus the very practical notes in PPTX on applications of consumer choice. We really need to nail the sequence, right? First, what do people want? Preferences. Second, what can they actually afford? Budget constraints.
And finally, the crucial third step, putting those together. Finding that sweet spot where wants meet reality, the optimal choice.
Okay, let's dive into step one, preferences. Before we even bring money into the picture, how do economists put some kind of structure on something as, well, messy as what people want? What are these bedrock assumptions about a rational consumer?
Well, we lean on three big assumptions. These are sort of the rules of the road that impose rationality and consistency. If these hold, then consumer behavior becomes predictable, mathematically tractable. First up is completeness. This one basically says, well, it means you can't just shrug your shoulders. If I show you two different bundles of goods, let's say basket A with 3 apples and 2 oranges, and basket B with 2 apples and 3 oranges, you have to be able to compare them.
So I have to say I prefer A, or I prefer B, or I'm indifferent between them. No, I don't know.
Exactly. You must have a preference, even if that preference is indifference, meaning they give you the same level of satisfaction. It just ensures preferences are defined across all possible options. Okay, second assumption, transitivity. This is the consistency rule, and it's absolutely vital. If you prefer A to B, and you also prefer B to C,
then you have to prefer A to C.
You got it. The classic example is cars. Prefer a Porsche to a Cadillac, prefer a Cadillac to a Chevy. Then, to be rational, you must prefer the Porsche to the Chevy. It prevents preferences from running in circles.
But wait a minute, does that always hold? I mean, in the real world, people get swayed by ads, mood, impulse buys. Don't we violate transitivity all the time? Like, I might prefer this fancy coffee maker today, but tomorrow, a slick ad for another one makes me flip my ranking in a way that doesn't quite add up.
That's a really fair point, and it's a known tension. Economists rely on the assumption of rationality and transitivity because, frankly, without it, building a predictive mathematical model becomes incredibly difficult, if not impossible. If preferences were totally erratic and inconsistent, the demand curves we derive from them would just be chaos. So transitivity is like the necessary scaffolding that lets us build the model and map preferences reliably.
Okay, so it's a simplifying assumption needed for the model to work.
Precisely. And the third assumption is pretty straightforward. More is better than less, or sometimes called non-satiation.
More stuff is good.
Basically, yeah. Goods are desirable. Consumers always prefer having more of a good to having less, even if it's just a tiny bit more. We usually frame this positively. We talk about goods like clean air or income, not bads like pollution, at least not directly in this basic setup.
Is there a limit, though? Can't you get full, like you really don't want another slice of pizza or another specialized wrench if you already have 5?
Theoretically, yes, satiation exists. But for the basic model, we generally assume consumers are operating in a zone where they haven't hit that absolute saturation point for the bundle of goods they're considering within their budget. If we had to model that 6th slice of pizza making you feel worse, we'd have to treat it as a bad or adjust the model. But for building this foundation, we stick with more is generally preferred. It works well for most broad consumption choices. #, indifference curves and properties.
All right, so if we accept those 3 assumptions, completeness, transitivity, and more is, better we can visualize preferences. And that's where the indifference curve comes in. So what am I actually looking at on that graph with, say, food on the x-axis and clothing on the y?
You're looking at a contour map of happiness, essentially. An indifference curve connects all the different combinations, all those market baskets of food and clothing that give the consumer the exact same level of satisfaction or utility.
So anywhere along that one specific curve, I'm equally happy. Indifferent.
Exactly. And because of that more is better assumption we just talked about, these curves have a couple of really important non-negotiable properties. First, they have to slope downwards.
Slide downwards.
Because if you have less of one good, say food, you absolutely must have more of the other good, clothing, to keep your satisfaction level the same. If it sloped upwards, that would mean a point with more of both goods gave the same satisfaction as a point with less, which violates more is better.
Okay, that makes sense. Give up some F, need more C to stay level. And the second property, you mentioned consistency.
Right. They can never, ever cross. Indifference curves cannot intersect. Think about what it would mean if they did.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, if two curves, say U1 and U2, crossed at some point, let's call it point A, and suppose point B is somewhere else on U1 and point C is somewhere else on U2, then A gives the same satisfaction as B, they're both on U1, and A gives the same satisfaction as C, both on U2. By transitivity, what must be true about B and C?
They have to get the same satisfaction, too.
Exactly. But visually, if they cross, you could easily have point B representing more of both goods than point C. And if B has more of both, more is better, says B must be preferred to C.
Ah, so crossing curves creates a contradiction. It violates either transitivity or more is better.
Precisely. Intersecting curves imply irrationality within the model's own rules. So they form a map of parallel-ish, non-intersecting, downward-sloping curves. ## diminishing marginal rate of substitution, MRA.
Okay, so they slope down, they don't cross. But they usually aren't straight lines either, right? They tend to be bowed inward toward the origin. What's that shape telling us? Economists call it convex, I think.
Yes, convex to the origin. And that shape captures a really key concept about valuation. The marginal rate of substitution, or MRS. The MRS is simply the magnitude of the slope of the indifference curve at any given point. Mathematically, we define it as MRS equals C delta F FF. It measures the maximum amount of the good on the vertical axis, clothing C, that a person is willing to give up to get exactly one more unit of the good on the horizontal axis, food, F, while staying on the same indifference curve, staying equally happy.
Okay, hold on. Why the negative sign in the formula again?
Good question. Since the curve slopes down, the change in C divided by the change in F, delta C, delta F5, will naturally be a negative number. We stick the negative sign in the MRS definition because we want to talk about the rate as a positive value. We want to say, I'll give up 5 units of clothing for 1 unit of food, not negative 5 units. It's just convention to express the rate as a positive magnitude.
Got it. It's the rate of willing substitution. And the convexity, the bowed-in shape, means this rate changes.
Yes, crucially, it means the MRS is diminishing as we move down along the curve. Let's make that concrete. Please do.
Imagine you start way up high in the curve. You have tons of clothing, say 20 units, but very little food, maybe just 1 unit. You're desperate for food. At that point, you might be willing to give up, say, 6 units of clothing just to get a second unit of food. Your MRS is 6.
Okay. High willingness to trade C for F.
Right. Now, slide down the curve. You've traded away clothing for food. Now you're at a point where you have, say, 5 units of clothing and 10 units of food. You've got plenty of food now, but clothing is becoming scarcer for you. If I ask you now how much clothing you'll give up for yet another unit of food, the 11th unit, you'll be much stingier. You might only be willing to give up, maybe, 1 unit of clothing. Your MRS has fallen from 6 down to 1.
Because you value that next unit of food less relative to clothing, since you already have a lot of food.
Precisely. This diminishing MRS reflects a fundamental observation about preferences. People generally prefer balanced market baskets over extremes. The more you have of one thing, the less you value getting even more of it relative to other things. That's why the curve is bowed in. So the shape itself is telling a story about diminishing marginal value. ## extreme preference cases. You mentioned exceptions. What if the goods are, like, totally interchangeable?
Yes. If two goods are perfect substitutes, the consumer sees them as, well, perfectly substitutable. They're always willing to trade them at a fixed, constant rate, no matter how much they have of each.
Like maybe generic store brand cola versus the name brand, if someone truly doesn't care.
Exactly. Or maybe 2 different brands of gasoline for your car. In this case, the indifference curves aren't bowed, they become straight lines. The MRS is constant along the entire line. If you see Coke and Pepsi as identical, you'll always trade 1 for 1. MRS is 1 everywhere.
Okay, straight lines for perfect substitutes. What's the other extreme? Things that have to go together.
Those are perfect complements. Goods that are only useful or satisfying when consumed together in fixed proportions. The classic example is left shoes and right shoes.
Can't do much with just one.
Right. Or maybe coffee and filters for some people.
Mhm.
For perfect complements, the indifference curves are shaped like right angles or L shapes.
L shapes.
Yeah.
How does that work?
Well, imagine you have 5 left shoes and 5 right shoes. Getting a 6th right shoe, while you still only have 5 left ones, doesn't increase your satisfaction at all, right? You're stuck on the same horizontal part of the L.
True. Need another left one.
Exactly. To get to a higher level of utility, a higher endurance curve, you need more of both goods in that fixed proportion. So the curve is flat, MRS is 0, you won't give up left shoes for more right shoes, or vertical, MRS is infinite. You'd give up anything else for a needed left shoe if you have excess right ones. There's no smooth substitution.
Okay, so the curves map out preferences. We
Mhm.
know higher curves are better. U2 is preferred to U1. That's an ordinal ranking, right? Just order, no magnitude. But we often talk about utility scores, like assigning numbers. Why do economists get touchy about how we interpret those numbers?
Because those numbers are essentially just labels. Ordinal utility is all we really need for this whole theory of consumer choice to work. It means we can rank the bundles. U3 is better than U2, which is better than U1, but the size of the number difference between them is arbitrary and meaningless.
So if basket A gives me 10 utils and basket B gives me 5 utils, I can only say I prefer A. I can't say A makes me twice as happy as B.
Exactly, that's the key distinction. Saying twice as happy would imply cardinal utility, where the numbers represent a measurable magnitude of satisfaction. But how would we actually measure that? There's no objective satisfactionometer.
It's like ranking movies. I know I liked movie A more than movie B, but I can't really put a number on how much more enjoyment I got.
That's a great analogy. We dropped the idea of cardinal utility largely because it's unmeasurable and, more importantly, unnecessary for explaining choices. All we need is the ability to rank bundles consistently, which the ordinal approach gives us based on those first 3 assumptions.
But can we still see patterns in the real world? The source mentions example 3.2. Can money buy happiness? Does survey data line up with this, even ordinally?
It does, quite nicely actually. When you look at large-scale surveys across countries or within a country, people with higher incomes generally report higher levels of life satisfaction or happiness. Money does seem to buy some happiness, or at least enables it.
Okay, so more income, higher utility curve is generally reachable.
Yes, but here's the crucial part that fits our theory. The relationship isn't linear. The increase in reported happiness gets smaller and smaller as income rises. Going from, say, $10,000 a year to $20,000 makes a huge difference in well-being.
Life-changing, probably.
Absolutely. But going from $150,000 to $160,000, it's nice, sure, but the additional happiness boost is much smaller.
Yeah, I can relate. That first real paycheck felt incredible. Later raises were great, but didn't have that same seismic impact on my day-to-day feeling of well-being.
That's exactly the phenomenon. It's consistent with the idea of diminishing marginal utility of income. Each extra dollar provides less additional satisfaction than the one before it. So this real-world observation strongly supports the theoretical framework we're building that people try to maximize well-being, and the value of increments eventually diminishes.
Okay, we've spent a lot of time mapping out the ideal world of wants and desires with indifference curves. But now, the dose of reality. Limited resources. Step 2, the budget constraint.
Right, this is where scarcity hits the model. The budget constraint defines what the consumer can actually afford. Graphically, we represent this with the budget line.
The straight line we usually see on these diagrams.
Exactly. This line shows all the possible combinations of our 2 goods. Let's stick with food and clothing that the consumer can purchase if they spend their entire income. Not more, not less. The equation for it is straightforward. The price of food times the quantity of food plus the price of clothing times the quantity of clothing must equal income. So PFF plus PCC equals IO.
So if my income is, say, $80 a week, food costs $1 per unit, and clothing costs $2 per unit, the line shows all combos like 80 food and 0 clothing, or 0 food and 40 clothing, or 40 food and 20 clothing. Anything that adds up to $80.
Precisely. And the most important feature of this line, for linking it back to preferences, is its slope. If you rearrange that budget equation to solve for C, the good on the vertical axis, you find the slope is DPF PCY.
The negative ratio of the prices.
Yes, and this slope represents something fundamentally different from the MRS. The MRS was the internal subjective rate the consumer was willing to trade. The slope of the budget line is the external objective rate the market forces them to trade at.
It's the opportunity cost dictated by market prices. Give up 1 unit of food.
And the market lets you buy PFPCUR units of clothing back. Using your example, slope is $12 or $2. To get one more unit of food costing $1, you must give up half a unit of clothing, which frees up $1 since clothing costs $2. This trade-off rate is constant along the line because prices are fixed for the consumer. That's why it's a straight line. Hashtag tag tag impact of economic changes.
Okay, so now we can see how changes in the economy affect what people can afford. What happens if just income changes? Say someone gets a raise, their income doubles.
A change in income with prices held constant causes a nice, clean, parallel shift of the budget line.
Outward for an increase, inward for a decrease.
Exactly. If income doubles, the line shifts straight out. The intercepts on both axes double. They can now buy twice as much food if they spend everything on food, or twice as much clothing if they spend everything on clothing. But crucially, the slope, PFPC2, doesn't change because prices haven't changed. The market trade-off rate is the same, they just have more purchasing power overall. Their opportunity set, all the affordable combinations, has expanded.
So things like a tax cut or maybe a cash stimulus check would just shift the line out like that.
Yes, a simple parallel shift reflecting more overall buying power without changing the relative cost of the goods.
Okay, what about price changes? Let's say the price of just one good, like food, PFly, goes down.
Yeah.
Maybe there's a big sale.
Now that's different. A change in the price of one good causes a budget line to rotate.
Rotate, how?
It pivots around the intercept of the good whose price didn't change. So if PW falls, the maximum amount of clothing you can buy, IPCC, stays the same. That point on the vertical axis is fixed.
Right, because clothing price and income are unchanged.
But the maximum amount of food you can buy, IPFI, increases because $P is now smaller. So the intercept on the horizontal axis moves outward. The whole line pivots, becoming flatter.
Flatter, meaning the slope PFPCCU got smaller in magnitude. Which makes sense, since $P went down, food is relatively cheaper now.
Exactly. A price change alters both the overall purchasing power, usually increasing it if a price falls, and the relative price, the market trade-off rate. This distinction between income shifts and price rotations is absolutely critical for understanding consumer responses.
Okay, one more scenario from the text. What if everything doubles?
Yeah.
Income doubles, the price of food doubles, and the price of clothing doubles, like pure inflation.
Ah, the proportionality case. You might feel richer looking at the bigger numbers, but what happens to the budget line?
Well, the slope is 2PC, which simplifies back to PFPC. The slope is the same.
Right, and the vertical intercept, it's now 2PC, which is just 1 of PCE, which is just 1 of PCC, same as before. And the horizontal intercept is 2PF, which is way PF, also the same.
I think the budget line doesn't change at all.
Not one bit.
Debate.
If all prices and income change by the exact same proportion, the consumer's affordable choices, their opportunity set, and the market trade-offs remain completely unchanged. Their real purchasing power hasn't moved. It's a powerful illustration of why economists focus on real variables, not nominal ones.
Okay, we've got the two pieces. Step 1, preferences mapped by indifference curves showing what the consumer wants. Step 2, the budget line showing what they can afford. Now the payoff. Step 3, putting them together to find the optimal choice. How does our rational consumer pick the single best satisfaction-maximizing basket?
They aim for the highest point on the mountain they can reach, given their climbing gear. The optimal market basket has to meet two conditions simultaneously. 1, it must be located on the budget line. They have to spend all their income. Why?
Because if they were inside the line, they'd have leftover income, and since more is better, they could buy more of something and increase their satisfaction.
Yeah.
So points inside aren't optimal.
Perfect. And points outside the budget line are unaffordable. So condition 1, be on the line. Condition 2, it must give the consumer the most preferred combination of goods. That means it needs to be on the highest possible indifference curve that still touches the budget line.
Ah, so you're looking for where the budget line just grazes
Yeah.
the highest indifference curve it can reach.
Exactly. That point of contact is typically a point of tangency. At this optimal point, the budget line and the indifference curve just kiss. And importantly, they have the exact same slope.
Okay, so the slopes are equal. That means the slope of the indifference curve, which we said was the MRS,
Yeah.
equals the slope of the budget line, which is the price ratio.
Precisely. This gives us the fundamental equation for consumer equilibrium. MRS equals PFPC2L.
That looks simple, but unpack that for us. What does it really mean for the consumer when those two ratios are equal?
It means the consumer has balanced their internal valuation with the market's external valuation. We often summarize this condition as marginal benefit marginal cost.
How so?
Think about what each side represents. The marginal benefit of consuming one more unit of food is measured by the MRS. It tells us how much clothing the consumer is subjectively willing to give up for that extra food. It's the personal value. The marginal cost of consuming one more unit of food is given by the price ratio, PFPC duo. It tells us how much clothing the market requires the consumer to give up to obtain that extra food. It's the market cost.
Okay. So if my willingness to give up clothing for food, MRS, is higher than the amount the market forces me to give up, price ratio, I'm getting a good deal on food in my own estimation.
Exactly. If MRS PFPCU, the marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost, you value the next unit of food more than it costs you in terms of clothing foregone. So what should you do?
Buy more food and less clothing. Keep trading until my willingness to trade, MRS, comes down and equals the price ratio.
Perfect. You keep adjusting your consumption bundle, moving along the budget line, substituting toward the good that gives you more bang for your buck in utility terms, until you reach that tangency point where your internal trade-off rate exactly matches the market's trade-off rate. At that point, there's no further adjustment that can make you better off. You've maximized your utility given your budget. Hashtag the equal marginal principle.
There's another way to think about this, right? Using marginal utility, the extra satisfaction from one more unit, the equal marginal principle.
Yes, it's an alternative and sometimes more intuitive way to express the same logic, especially when thinking about spending money. It focuses on the marginal utility per dollar spent. The condition is that the marginal utility derived from the last dollar spent on food must equal the marginal utility derived from the last dollar spent on clothing. And this should hold for all goods the consumer buys. FRAC MUCPC.
So the extra utility points per dollar for food should equal the extra utility points per dollar for clothing.
Exactly. Let's say you have one more dollar to spend. If spending it on food gives you, say, 10 units of marginal utility, MUF4, and food costs $2, PF4, the utility per dollar is $102, is $102, $500. Now, if spending that same dollar on clothing gives you 8 units of utility, MUC2, but clothing costs $1, PC2, the utility per dollar is $81, is $88.
So the last dollar spent on clothing gave me more satisfaction in 8 utils than the last dollar spent on food, 5 utils.
Right, so you're not optimizing. You should take $1 away from food, losing 5 utils, and spend it on clothing, gaining 8 utils. Your total utility goes up by 3 utils.
And I should keep doing that, shifting spending from food to clothing.
Until the marginal utility per dollar is equalized across both. As you buy less food, its MUF5 might rise due to diminishing MU. As you buy more clothing, its MUC will fall. Eventually, you'll reach a point where MUFPF will MUCPC11. At that point, the last dollar spent on any good yields the exact same marginal utility, meaning you've allocated your income perfectly to maximize total satisfaction. It's a very practical rule for thinking about optimal spending. Hashtag tag corner solutions and automobile application.
What if the optimal choice involves buying none of one good? Like someone chooses only ice cream and 0 frozen yogurt, even though both are available. Does the tangency rule still hold?
Good point. That's what we call a corner solution. The consumer maximizes utility by spending their entire budget on just one of the goods, ending up at one of the corners of the budget line graph on one of the axes.
So no tangency then.
Typically not. At a corner solution, the indifference curve usually intersects the budget line at the axis, but its slope, MRS, doesn't equal the slope of the budget line, PFPCS. In fact, at a corner where only food is consumed, 0 clothing, the MRS is usually greater than or equal to the price ratio, MRS, PFPCL. This inequality means the consumer values the first unit of clothing, what they'd get by giving up food, less than what the market charges for it relative to food. Or, put differently, they value the last unit of food consumed so much more relative to its price than they value clothing that they specialize entirely in food. They'd ideally like to trade away clothing they don't have for more food, but they're stuck at the 0 clothing corner.
So the equality MRS PFPC only holds for interior solutions where positive amounts of both goods are consumed.
Correct. Corner solutions are characterized by an inequality.
And this whole framework, finding the optimal point, it has direct business applications.
Right.
Like the example 3.3 about designing cars.
Absolutely. Car manufacturers use this thinking constantly. Imagine they're designing a car and can allocate budget between different attributes, like size, interior room, and acceleration engine power. They know consumers have different preferences, different indifference curves for these attributes. Let's say they assume a budget constraint representing the total cost or price point, say $30,000, which can buy different combinations of size and acceleration based on their engineering costs. the prices, PSIs, and PSL.
So a budget line for attributes.
Exactly. Now, think about a potential buyer for a sports coupe, like a Mustang. Their indifference curves are likely quite steep. They have a high MRS. They're willing to give up a lot of size to get just a little bit more acceleration.
They value speed over space.
Right. So their optimal point, where their steep indifference curve is tangent to the attribute budget line, will be way over towards the acceleration axis. They'll choose a car configuration that maximizes acceleration, even if it's cramped inside.
And someone looking at an SUV, like an Explorer.
Their preferences are different. Their indifference curves are probably much flatter. They have a low MRS. They'd give up quite a bit of acceleration to get just a bit more size or comfort. Their tangency point will be much closer to the size axis.
So by understanding the shapes of indifference curves, the MRS, for different market segments through surveys and data analysis, car companies can design specific models, Mustang versus Explorer, that hit the optimal tangency point for those target consumers, maximizing their utility and hopefully sales.
It's a direct translation of the theory into product design and market segmentation strategy. Find the tangency points for your key customer groups.
Okay, let's shift gears now and apply this powerful framework to some real-world policy problems. The notes give us a great example. A mayor trying to decide how best to provide housing assistance to a low-income family.
Yes, this is a classic application that really highlights the trade-offs involved in different types of government aid. Let's set it up. A family has $2,000 a month income. Housing costs $400 per unit, like a room. And all other goods have a price normalized to $1 per unit.
And the city wants to provide $800 worth of assistance. Three options are on the table: a housing voucher, a direct cash grant, or a price subsidy for housing.
Right. First, let's visualize the housing voucher worth $800. This voucher can only be spent on housing. How does that affect the budget line?
Well, they still only have $2,000 of their own cash for other goods, so the vertical intercept doesn't change. But the voucher gives them $800 worth of housing for free, which is 2 units, $400 per unit.
Exactly. So the budget line gets kinked. It starts at the original vertical intercept, $2,000 other goods, 0 housing, moves horizontally outward by 2 units of housing, reflecting the free housing from the voucher, and then slopes downwards with the original slope based on the market prices.
So the voucher definitely lets them reach a higher indifference curve, say U2, compared to no assistance U1. They consume more housing and are better off.
Correct. Now compare that to option 2, an unrestricted cash grant of $800.
Okay, this is simpler. It's just like the income increase we discussed earlier. Their total income becomes $2,800. The entire budget line just shifts outward in parallel.
Right, a parallel shift. The new budget line, L cash, lies entirely outside the original one. Now, here's the crucial comparison for the mayor. How does the outcome under the cash grant compare to the voucher, assuming both cost the city $800?
Well, the cash grant line offers more possibilities, doesn't it? The family can choose any combination along that higher parallel line. The voucher restricted them somewhat.
Precisely. Because the cash grant offers more freedom of choice, the family can typically reach an even higher indifference curve, say U3, than they could with the voucher U2.
Why higher?
They might decide that given the extra $800, their optimal point involves spending maybe only $600 more on housing and $200 more on other things like food, education, or childcare. The voucher forced the full $800 into housing. The cash grant lets them allocate it according to their own preferences to reach their personal maximum utility.
So if the mayor's goal is purely to make the family as well off as possible, maximize their utility, the cash grant is generally superior.
Generally, yes. The only situation where the voucher is just as good as cash is if the family, given the cash, would have chosen to spend at least $800 of it on housing anyway. In that case, the voucher constraint wasn't binding. But if they prefer to spend less than $800 on housing, cash lets them reach a higher utility level. It highlights the economic value of choice.
Okay, but there's option 3, the housing subsidy. Instead of a voucher or cash, the city pays, say, 50% of the family's housing costs. So the price per unit drops from $400 to $200 for this family.
Now we're changing the relative price of housing. What does that do to the budget line?
Like the price change example, it rotates. The vertical intercept, maximum other goods, stays at $2,000. But the horizontal intercept, maximum housing, moves way out because housing is now cheaper. The line gets much flatter.
Exactly, a rotation outward. Now, how does the housing consumption under the subsidy typically compare to the cash grant, assuming they're designed to cost the city roughly the same amount?
Looking at the typical diagrams, the subsidy seems to encourage much more housing consumption than the equivalent cash grant does. The optimal point, H2, under the subsidy is usually further out on the housing axis than under the cash grant, H3. Hashtag income versus substitution effects.
And why is that? Why does the subsidy pack a bigger punch in terms of boosting housing consumption specifically?
This must be that income and substitution effect thing we talked about with price changes.
Bingo. Both the cash grant and the subsidy make the family feel richer. They increase their real income or purchasing power. This is the income effect. Since housing is usually a normal good, people buy more as income rises, the income effect in both programs pushes towards more housing consumption.
Okay, both have an income effect.
But only the subsidy changes the relative price. By making housing cheaper, $200, compared to other goods, $1, the subsidy creates a powerful substitution effect. It gives the family a strong incentive to substitute away from the now relatively more expensive other goods and toward the cheaper housing.
The cash grant has zero substitution effect because it doesn't change the price ratio PHPOG.
Correct. So the subsidy boosts housing demand through both channels, income and substitution, while the cash grant only works through the income channel.
So the advice to the mayor depends entirely on the goal. If the primary goal is maximizing the family's overall perceived well-being or utility.
Cash is usually best because of freedom of choice.
But if the goal is specifically to increase the quantity and quality of housing consumed, maybe due to positive externalities associated with better housing.
Then the subsidy is the more powerful tool precisely because it harnesses that substitution effect. The economic analysis clarifies this trade-off. It doesn't say which goal is right, but it shows how to achieve each one most effectively. Hashtag rationing and inefficiency.
Let's look at another form of government intervention, rationing. The notes use the example of gasoline rationing during the 1979 oil crisis. How does limiting the quantity someone can buy affect their choice and well-being?
Rationing directly limits choice. Suppose a market price would lead a consumer to want to buy, say, 30 gallons of gas a week, point C on indifference curve U2, but the government imposes a ration limit of only 20 gallons.
They physically can't buy more than 20, even if they have the money and want to.
Right. This effectively chops off the budget line, making it vertical at the 20-gallon mark like line 80E in the Pindyke figure. The consumer is forced back from their preferred point C onto a lower indifference curve, like U1, at the ration limit, point D. They're clearly worse off than they would be without the ration, assuming the price was low enough for them to afford point C.
So rationing is generally inefficient because it prevents people from reaching their utility maximizing point where their MRS equals the price ratio.
Exactly. It forces them into a suboptimal bundle and reduces their utility. However, there's a nuance mentioned in the text. Rationing usually happens when the government is also holding the price below the market clearing level.
Creating a shortage that necessitates the rationing.
Right. So while the rationed consumer is worse off than they'd be at that low price without a ration, they might actually be better off than if the government let the price rise to its high market clearing level. A very high price might push them onto an even lower indifference curve, like point F in the figure, than the one they reach under rationing, U1.
So rationing is inefficient compared to an ideal market, but it might be preferred by some consumers compared to facing the very high prices that would eliminate the shortage without rationing.
It's a complex trade-off, often driven by equity concerns alongside efficiency ones. Hashtag bias in cost of living indexes, CPI.
Okay, final application, and it's a big one. Measuring inflation and cost of living, particularly with the Consumer Price Index, CPI, used for things like Social Security adjustments. What's the problem here from a consumer theory perspective?
The core issue is trying to measure the ideal cost of living index. This ideal index would tell us exactly how much income someone needs today to achieve the same level of utility or satisfaction they had in a base year, given today's prices.
So how much money makes me just as happy now as I was back then?
Essentially, yes. The problem is that the traditional way the CPI was calculated, using what's called the Last Bears Index, doesn't quite measure that.
What does the Last Bears Index measure?
It measures how much it costs today to buy the exact same basket of goods and services that was consumed in the base year. It uses fixed base year quantity weights.
Okay, but what's wrong with that? Seems straightforward.
The problem is substitution bias. We just spent all this time establishing that rational consumers substitute away from goods whose prices rise relatively more and toward goods whose prices rise relatively less or fall. The Last Bears Index completely ignores this behavior.
It assumes people keep buying the old fixed bundle even when relative prices change dramatically.
Exactly. Let's take Rachel from the example. Suppose the price of books, which she bought a lot of in the base year, skyrockets, while the price of food stays relatively stable. A Les Bears index calculates the cost of her original book-heavy bundle at the new high book prices.
But Rachel wouldn't buy that bundle anymore. She'd substitute towards more food and fewer books to maximize her utility under the new prices.
Precisely. So if the government adjusts her Social Security check based on the Les Bears index, giving her enough money to afford the old expensive bundle, she's actually being overcompensated. She can take that money, buy her new, preferred, more food-heavy bundle, and end up on a higher indifference curve, better off than she was in the base year.
So the Les Bears index systematically overstates the true increase in the cost of maintaining the same level of utility.
Yes. This substitution bias was estimated to be quite significant, maybe over 0.5 percentage point per year, possibly more. When applied to huge programs like Social Security, that overstatement meant billions of dollars in extra government spending over time, simply because the index didn't account for rational consumer substitution.
Was there an alternative index mentioned?
Yes, the PASH index. This one uses current year quantities as weights. It asks how much the current bundle would have cost back in the base year. This index tends to have the opposite problem. It typically understates the ideal cost of living increase.
So Les Bears overstates, PASH understates. What was the policy response?
Recognizing the significant fiscal impact of the Les Bears bias, statistical agencies like the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics move towards using chain-weighted price indexes. These indexes update the quantity weights much more frequently, sometimes every month or quarter.
So they capture the changing consumption patterns more quickly.
Yes, by updating the basket more often, chain-weighted indexes better reflect how consumers are actually substituting in response to price changes. They don't perfectly eliminate the bias, but they significantly reduce it compared to the old fixed-weight Les Bears method. It's a major practical improvement in economic measurement, driven entirely by understanding consumer choice theory. #outro.
Wow, okay. We've covered a lot of ground. We started with those basic, almost philosophical assumptions about rational preferences.
Completeness, transitivity, more is better.
Built up indifference curves and budget lines, found the optimal tangency point, and then applied it all the way to massive policy issues like welfare program design and multi-billion-dollar adjustments to the CPI.
It really is fascinating how that core distinction between the income effect and the substitution effect plays out. You see it clearly in the housing example. If you just want to boost someone's overall purchasing power and let them maximize their own utility, cash, pure income effect is usually the way.
But if you, as the government, specifically want to encourage more consumption of a particular good, like housing or maybe healthcare,
You really need to leverage that substitution effect. That means changing the relative price through something like a subsidy. It gives people that extra nudge to shift their consumption patterns in the desired direction. The theory tells you which lever to pull for which outcome.
it really equips policymakers with a powerful, if simplified, model of behavior. Okay, as you're reviewing all this preferences, budgets, MRS, price ratios, income and substitution effects, here's a final thought to chew on linking back to policy incentives. We saw that simple cash welfare can sometimes create a work disincentive, right? Because leisure is often considered a normal good. The income effect of the welfare payment might lead people to buy more leisure, meaning work less.
Yes, that's a potential consequence depending on the shape of the indifference curves between income and leisure.
So consider the Earned Income Tax Credit, the EITC. It's specifically designed to encourage low-income individuals to work more. How does the structure of the EITC, the way the credit phases in as earnings rise, plateaus, and then phases out, manipulate the budget constraint between labor income and leisure to ensure the incentive is primarily towards more work, countering that potential income effect push towards leisure?
That's a great question. It really gets into the details of how the EITC shifts and changes the slope of the budget constraint in the income-leisure space. The phase-in range effectively increases the net wage rate, making the budget line steeper and strengthening the substitution effect, work more because leisure is now relatively more expensive. The design aims to make sure that for many low-income workers, the incentive to work outweighs the simple income effect that might encourage less work. It's a prime example of using consumer choice theory, specifically income and substitution effects in the labor supply context, to engineer a policy aimed at a specific behavioral outcome.
Definitely something to think about, how the precise shape of the policy intervention interacts with those underlying principles of choice. Thanks for joining our deep dive today.